Greetings, students. Welcome to this lecture. This lecture is going to take up what might seem like a really strange question. You can see it here on the screen right now. Where did the book of Daniel come from? Here's another way of framing that question. How did we get the book of Daniel? So let's just pretend for a moment that you've opened up your Bibles, and you are looking at the book of Daniel, and you ask the question, well, how did this book of Daniel get to be in this collection of Jewish literature that we call the Old Testament? Where did it come from? Well, what we're going to find is that there is, in fact, no easy answer here. And that there is no kind of clear and clean-cut genealogy either for how we got the book of Daniel sort of originally, did it start with oral stories? Did it, kind of grow? Were these visions that Daniel has, or these apocalyptic visions at the end of Daniel, how were those recorded? Not only is it sort of ambiguous in terms of its origins, but it also has a variety of paths that it takes historically in terms of its manuscript tradition. So let's begin with a couple of really simple points. Firstly here, let's look at that English translation. You could be looking at NRSV, NIV, whatever one you like. How did that get into your hands? Where did it come from? Well, let me put it in a different way. If a publisher were to come to me and say, Michael, we want you to render a new translation of the book of Daniel and, into English, and I would say, okay, that's fine. What would my starting point be? It would be this particular codex, this particular manuscript that we call Codex Leningradensia. It is in St. Petersburg, Russia. So sometimes people refer to it as Codex Petropolitanus to refer to, of course, this. It used to be Leningrad, right now St. Petersburg, a lovely city. But the manuscript is dated to 1009 of the Common Era. That means 1,000 years after Jesus is born. This manuscript is dated to that. It is a medieval manuscript of a book that, at least in its earliest stages, Daniel maybe began in the 6th century. So this manuscript is 1,600, maybe 1,500 years removed from the sort of early origins of the book of Daniel. That is a really long time. Often this manuscript is abbreviated as MT, which refers to Masoretic text. This Masoretic tradition of codices also includes Cairo Codex of the Prophets and the Aleppo Codex. We won't be dealing much with those. But the Masoretes were responsible for adding vowels and a whole complicated system of notations to these manuscripts, and in particular, for our purposes, this Codex Leningradensia. And so that's one way of saying where did the book of Daniel come from? Your English translation comes from some scholars' attempt to render the Codex Leningradensia. Now, here's another interesting point about that codex and about the book of Daniel in its primary language form. Linguistically, the book of Daniel itself is actually bilingual. It is written in both Hebrew and in Aramaic. This is very interesting. We'll dig into this more once we get to the second chapter, but that transition from Hebrew to Aramaic actually happens in Daniel 4. So you can go and look at that yourself right now. In fact, the text itself in Hebrew indicates that a shift has happened. For whatever reason, some translations don't. It says Aramaic in the like they spoke to the king in Aramaic. It says it specifically in Hebrew. For some reason, there are some translations like the NIV that don't translate that part, that it was, Aramaic that was spoken. Really strange. I'm not quite sure why, but you'll find it in the NRSV. There is a specific linguistic shift. It's not subtle. It's explicit. It happens right there in the second chapter of Daniel. So that already gives us an interesting insight into the book of Daniel that it is bilingual. It's a bilingual book, Hebrew and Aramaic, and that may say something to the book's complicated compositional history, alongside the fact that Daniel is itself a kind of compilation of two different genres, right? We have the court tale genres and then the apocalypses, which are quite different, and those two genres do kind of point to its complex compositional history. But so that's one way of answering the question, is that your English translation is based on this particular medieval manuscript, and the scholars attempt to work with that manuscript and reconstruct difficult readings. Now, but that's not the end of the story. We have to ask this important question: why does Pope Francis, sorry, the capitalization got messed up here. Sorry, Pope Francis, Holy Father, no disrespect intended. Why does Pope Francis read a different Daniel than Protestant? Yeah, we have another one here. And Jews, than Protestant and Jews do. So this is a fact that Daniel, the Danielic tradition, as communicated within the Catholic Bible, the various Orthodox Bible, Ethiopian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, the Coptic Church, they read a different collection of Danielic literature than do Protestants and Jews as well, because Protestants and Jews are reading translations from the same manuscripts. Okay, so here is a list of the Roman Catholic canon, and so it does have the Book of Daniel. You'll see here they list it under the prophets. It does have the Book of Daniel, but then you have this phrase, with additions. What's this all about? The Roman Catholic version of Daniel has has several different additions that one primarily finds in a different manuscript tradition than is used by the Protestants. And so we will look at some of the additions, by the way, later in the semester. For now, I'm just going to lift them up. And so there are several different streams of transmission when it comes to the Book of Daniel. Here we have another capitalization thing. I switched the template just before doing this, and I apparently missed some of these capitalizations, so I apologize for that. On the one hand, we have the Masoretic text, right? We were just talking about this, the sometimes called Codex Leningradensia. But there's a whole separate tradition of the transmission of Daniel in Greek. And within that, there are several transitions. So we have the Old Greek, which maybe you date it late 2nd, early 1st century BCE, and then the Theodosian stream of Greek Daniel, again, 2nd century CE. Now, these Greek versions have major pluses. Pluses is just a way that scholars talk about additions. And so we have the story of Susanna, the prayer of Azariah, and the Song of the Three Jews, which is embedded within the Daniel stories in chapter 3 in particular. And then we have Bel and the Snake, sometimes called Bel and the Dragon. Now, if you have the New Revised Standard Version, these pluses, so-called pluses found in the Greek, can be found in the deuterocanonical section. So just keep that in mind. These are Danielic stories that are within the tradition of Daniel, but that are not included within the Masoretic text tradition, that is not included within Leningradensia, and therefore not included within Protestant or Jewish Bibles. They are included, however, these pluses, in, as I said, the forms of Orthodoxy, Ethiopian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, the Coptic Church, etc. All of them have these more expansive collections of Danielic literature. We're going to read these stories, okay? I'm not going to go into them right now. I just want you, the point of all of this is to show you how complicated it is to answer this question, what is the Book of Daniel and where does it actually come from? Now, there are significant differences between even these two versions, Old Greek and Theodosian, especially in chapters 4 through 6. So let me put that in a different way. If you were to read the Old Greek version of Daniel and then the Theodosian version of Daniel, you would find significant differences even between those two, okay? Now, in terms of kind of translational profiles, this is a way that scholars like to talk about what kind of translation is it? What is its general thrust? The Old Greek tends to be generally dynamic, whereas the Theodotion tends to have a little more formal equivalence and it seems to be revising the Old Greek to the Masoretic text. So if you imagine, if you had, you look at this last sentence here, you have three different textual entities here. You have the Old Greek, Theodotion's Greek translation, and then the Masoretic text, which is in Hebrew. Theodotion is taking the taking the Old Greek and correcting it to be more like the Masoretic text. Okay, so that's what it means that it is a revision of Old Greek to MT. So there's a lot going on here, and there are literally people who spend entire academic careers working with these differences. Okay, so I'm simplifying a lot. All that I want you to see is that the textual tradition of Danielic literature is very complicated, and we cannot necessarily pick up our English version of Daniel and say, this is the book of Daniel, end of story, a period at the end of the sentence. It is the book of Daniel used by Protestants based on the Leningrad Codex, right? But turn to other Christian bodies, like Catholics, the Orthodox, etc., and you will find a more expansive version of Danielic literature. What is meant by Daniel is there's a bigger, kind of more, like I said, expansive, I guess is just the right word, a more expansive Danielic tradition. There's more about Daniel in these other traditions of Christianity outside of Protestantism. So that's important to say. And Theodotion will ultimately displace the Old Greek in the early church. And so this is from a quote from Jerome. By the judgment of the teachers of the church, the Septuagint edition, by which he means the Old Greek, has been rejected in the case of this book, and it is the translation of Theodotion, which is commonly read since it agrees with the Hebrew as well as with other translations. Now, something that's important to note here is that it was the Greek translations of the Old Testament that were used in the early church, not the Hebrew. Okay, and so the Greek in the early church had precedence over these Hebrew texts, the Hebrew texts that we now use, and so that's just important. Another way of putting this is that the Old Testament of the early church was in Greek, and it was the Septuagint. So, now let's talk a bit about the book of Daniel among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, when I talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls, we're talking about a kind of loose collection, a collection of texts from both before and after the turn of the century, found along the shores of the Dead Sea. And the initial kind of cache of scrolls was found in 1947. There's some lore, and a mystery around how they were exactly found. We'll just say that initial batch was found in 1947. And Daniel is well attested in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So just to say something about this kind of system of codes here. Let's look at 1Q Daniel A, okay, or 1Q Daniel or 1Q 71. The 1 refers to which of the 11 caves it was found in. The Q means Qumran. Qumran is another way of referring to the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's people refer to it as either Wadi Qumran or else the Dead Sea. So we have Q, which refers to Qumran, and then Dan, which obviously refers to Daniel, and then we have an additional manuscript designation. And so what this shows here is that this particular Qumranic Daniel manuscript includes these verses. These are the verses, of course, that we use in our modern English translations. So you can see that the book of Daniel is very, very well represented, and across the centuries as well. You have texts from as early as the late 2nd or early 1st century BCE, all the way up into the first half of the 1st century and the mid 1st century CE. So spanning quite a bit of time, Daniel, for a lot of reasons, would have been an important book for the Qumran community, probably especially because of the apocalyptic material, which we'll learn about quite a bit more later in the semester. But what's interesting about the Qumran material is that it gives us yet another bit of evidence as to, as we try to piece together the book of Daniel's compositional history and answer the question ultimately, where does it come from, right? So the Qumran fragments largely agree with the MT, which is to say that Leningrad Codex, the Leningrad-based codex that most Protestant, that most English translations, I should say, most English translations are based on in the modern world. So they agree closely with that Masoretic text tradition. All 12 chapters are attested at Qumran, and the shift from Hebrew to Aramaic in verse 4 is recorded specifically in 1Q Daniel A, and the shift back to Hebrew from Aramaic at the end of chapter 7 is recorded in 4Q Daniel D. So that kind of bilingual nature of Daniel is present even in these early texts. So that this allows us to say with great confidence that that bilingual shift from Hebrew to Aramaic and then Aramaic back to Hebrew it was part of these early texts as well. It wasn't added at some super late date or something like that. So if you're kind of more interested in some of those issues related to textual criticism and what the kind of how the book of Daniel is represented in the Dead Sea Scrolls, then here's a nice article for you from Eugene Ulrich, who has done just fabulous work with the Dead Sea Scrolls in general and on Daniel in particular. So I highly recommend that. I'm not going to assign it. It's sort of out of the purview of this class. We're not going to be focusing a lot on kind of textual criticism and manuscript history. So, but if you're interested in that stuff, this is a great article. Finally, here's one of the kind of the big takeaway. There is no single book of Daniel. What we actually have when we consider the broader Christianity more broadly to include Catholicism, Orthodoxy, Protestantism, there is no single book of Daniel. What we have is Danielic literature, some of which is within the Protestant canon, Masoretic text, right? Daniel 1 through 12, and some of which is well outside of it. And so there is no single kind of family history for Daniel, textual family history for Daniel. It is varied and it is complicated. We can't even really say there is a book of Daniel. We really have to talk about it in terms of Danielic literature. So what that means right now is that this weekend, if Daniel were sort of on the liturgical menu for all churches across the world, or Orthodox, Catholics, Protestants, the three of them could potentially be reading different versions of Daniel, or even different segments from Daniel, even sections found in like Susanna and Azariah, the prayer of Azariah and the Song of the Three Jews, sections dealing with Daniel that Protestants, if they stay within their canon only, will never read. That's interesting, right? And complicates what we mean when we're actually talking about the book of Daniel. So this class will pay attention to those additional texts, those additional narratives, in part because they're really interesting theologically and also historically. So we will be looking at those alongside the sort of normal Protestant chapters from the book of Daniel. So what does all this mean theologically? What does it mean for our understanding of God's word? Well, at the very least, what it means is that it's that we have to be careful what we say when we're talking about the book of Daniel, because potentially, right, the book of Daniel is being heard as God's word in different communities that in fact have some more expansive, some more restricted versions of the book of Daniel. So hopefully all of this is helpful to all of you. If you have questions, you know how to get in touch with me. Otherwise, enjoy your ongoing adventures with the book of Daniel. Thanks.